Um, though I know a lot of people don't use Second Life, I think most people could probably grant that it is a interesting space to examine, say, cyber culture or cyber community. And one of the things I'm very interested in looking into recently is Second Life's open source project, a particular one called Open Collar. Now, to begin, let me introduce what I think a lot of people in the cyber community think that open source will do. There's a sense that open source is by its nature a liberating political movement, that open source software will extend freedom, okay? That open source is about freedom, and that seems to be the political movement. If you go look at the documentary Revolution OS, it's clearly implicit in there that somehow open source project with Linux would give freedom, whereas the Microsoft OS and potentially by extension the Mac OS would reduce one's freedom. And I'm not, actually happen to believe in that in Linux. I think Linux is a liberating movement. But the overall political opinion that open source is liberating by its very nature, the fact that that technology is open to contribution, open to distribution, open to testing, is liberating human beings. I think you have to look, if you look at Second Life, there's a paradox of something I call, well, it's the open collar paradox. The biggest open source project that I've ever seen in Second Life personally is a project called Open Collar, okay? Open Collar is produced by the community that's into sex play, cyber bondage play in Second Life. It's incredibly common, and you will find hundreds of people, if you look, who own and wear open collar. Now, what's open collars do? Open collar, any collar, whether it's an open source collar or whether it's a collar that's been developed by programmers, will grant on to a person who is the collar owner overwrite rules on the person wearing the collar. So the point is that by wearing a collar, you essentially slave your identity in Second Life to a master, okay? So I just find it a very interesting paradox that the largest open source project that I've found within Second Life community is a product for making slaves. It's a slavery system. Now, that's a bit simplistic. I mean, there's an irony in there. There's a perfectly legitimate response to people who play cyber is that they actually are exploring sexual identity, and they're using the open source model to allow them a greater freedom to exploring sexual identity. I think that's actually a very valid point, but I think it's also an interesting kind of paradox to show you that, don't assume that just because you develop software and license software under a certain model, in this case open source model, that you are innately enhancing the liberation of every single person involved in it. The primary, more people wear open collars in order to escape their own freedom and form bondage relationships with other identities in Second Life than contribute to the code or contribute to its distribution. This even goes particularly further, is that I'm a personal advocate for Linux. I've tried to get less computer literate people I know to install Linux systems on their computers to make it, thinking that this would free them from the Microsoft updates or the Mac and iTunes. This would give them freedom for control of their computers. What consistently they all say is that this product is so complicated that it actually makes them more dependent on an open source community or an expert like myself, and I've been accused of trying to take over their experience with software. And when I was watching Revolution OS, I do wonder if some of the people, particularly Eric Raymond, whether they really want to control people's computers, whether it really is about liberation of freedom, or really if it is about domination of computers by a particular cyber class. I think what you saw with Jobs, I know people pronounce it Jobs' death, is a lot of people really felt as though a very controlled, very proprietary platform and tech company, the iPhone, the iTunes situation, is extremely liberating and empowering to them. I don't think you were going to see that kind of same massive sense of ordinary people saying they felt that they were enabled and empowered when major founders of the Linux project passed away. It's not really something that a lot of people, ordinary people, non-technical people, feel as though has empowered them and enabled them to use the computer as well. For techie people, it's been enormously liberating. If you're starting a technology company, all the open source stuff, MySQL, Linux, all that stuff is fantastically liberating if you are a small .com startup in Silicon Valley right now or in San Francisco looking for venture capital. Linux is extremely liberating for you. But it doesn't necessarily follow that it promotes an ideal freedom or an ideal liberation, which doesn't exist. Liberation and freedom is continually constructed through daily interactions between people and the way power is established between people. Okay? So a bunch of computer programmers could build on platforms like PHP, MySQL, and other open standards and open source platforms, as I do, and it frees them from control. They don't have to buy things from Microsoft. They don't have to agree to license agreements. They don't ever have to check anything. They don't have to give anything away. They just install the stuff and build. Okay? That interaction is liberating. Okay? But that doesn't necessarily mean that every person's interaction in that system may be liberating. I may actually use all this open source stuff, say if I'm Mark Zuckerberg, to create a system to collect information about people around the world and sell it to corporations. So if you're Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, you take PHP, MySQL, and an open source, open platform, you collect data about what people like, what people buy, what people are interested in, whose people's friends are, whose people's families are, and then you sell it to companies for marketing to make money. So it's very possible to use open source to monitor people, to create surveillance of people, and in the case of Open Collar in Second Life, it's very possible to build open source technology that allows human beings to escape their own burden of freedom and give it to another person. The fact of the matter is that human beings use these kinds of technologies as tools for gaining certain types of goals. Sometimes the goal is to free themselves of controls of outsiders to pursue their creative images. Sometimes the goal is to create surveillance, monitoring, and even direct control of people. Sometimes the goal is to escape freedom. Open source software can satisfy all of those tools or needs as well, if not potentially better than any other software. So what you get in open source is you get a tool that has a lot of, say, maybe degrees of freedom, you could describe, but those degrees of freedom can be deployed very easily to non-liberating projects. And open source freedom gives freedom to some people, like say Mark Zuckerberg, to be more dominant in their social relationship with their users. And I think the Open Collar is a beautiful little metaphor of that. You know, you see people being forced to do sexually humiliating things wearing a bit of technology, and that technology is openly developed, openly distributed. You can make any copies of it. You can change the code you want. The person wearing the collar can go in there and change their code any way they want. But the choice is to escape freedom with it.